The first thing I noticed was the smell, wet pennies and rotting apples, thick enough to chew. It rolled out of the cellar the moment I cracked the padlock, like something down there had been holding its breath for 30 years and finally let go. My name is Jack Harlan, and I had just driven 8 hours from Brooklyn with nothing but a duffel bag, a dead grandfather's house key, and the dumb idea that a free cabin in upstate New York was going to fix everything that had gone wrong in my life. By the time I stood on that sagging porch in Eldridge Hollow, watching fog swallow the last of the daylight, I already knew I had made a terrible mistake. The bus had dropped me at the edge of town 2 hours earlier. The driver refused to go any farther than the faded welcome sign. Roads washed out past the old mill, he lied. I could see the road just fine, it was the look in his eyes that told the truth. He didn't want to get any closer to the Harlan place. Nobody did. I walked the last mile with my bag over my shoulder, boots crunching on gravel that hadn't felt tires in years. Pines crowded the shoulders, so tall their tops disappeared into the low clouds. Every few steps I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Branches swaying when there was no wind, shadows sliding between trunks like animals that didn't want to be seen. I told myself it was exhaustion. I had not slept much since the layoffs, since the breakup, since the night after night of staring at a ceiling I could no longer afford. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered from childhood visits, but meaner somehow, like it had been waiting for me to grow up so it could finish whatever it started when I was 9. Gray logs, green moss climbing the walls, windows filmed with decades of grime. The key turned hard, metal screaming against metal. When the door swung open, the smell hit me again, only fainter, as if the house itself had been breathing through its mouth until I arrived. I dropped my bag in the living room and stood there listening. Complete silence, except for the soft tick of an old wall clock that had stopped at 3:17. Dust floated in the weak light coming through the curtains. Everything was exactly where Grandpa left it the day he died. Coffee cup on the table, half-finished crossword, boots by the door still caked with dried mud. The lawyer said he'd been found in bed, peaceful, heart attack. Looking around now, I wasn't so sure. I spent the first afternoon doing normal things that made me feel like a man taking possession of his inheritance. I opened windows to air the place out. I swept floors. I carried in firewood from the lean-to out back. Every chore felt watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see Grandpa standing in the hallway in his red flannel shirt, grinning that crooked grin he saved for when he knew something I didn't. He never appeared, but the feeling never left. Night came fast in the hollow. By 5 o'clock the sun was gone and the fog pressed against the glass like it wanted in. I built a fire, cooked chili from a can, and tried to read one of the moldy paperbacks on the shelf. Couldn't focus. The quiet was too loud. Around 9 I gave up and went looking for the fuse box, figuring I'd get the lights working. That was when I found the cellar door behind the kitchen pantry. Heavy oak, iron hinges, padlock shiny with new scratches, as if someone had been checking it regularly. The bolt cutters were hanging right there on a peg, like Grandpa had left them for me as a gift. I told myself I was just being thorough. New owner, new responsibilities. I told myself a lot of things while I worked the jaws around the hasp. The lock snapped with a sound like a small bone breaking. The door opened downward, stairs. Disappearing into black that smelled of iron and overripe fruit. My phone flashlight barely cut the dark. 13 steps down, same as every horror movie ever made. At the bottom the beam landed on shelves. Rows and rows of glass jars, quart size, the kind Grandma used for preserves. Only these weren't peaches or tomatoes. These held pale things floating in cloudy fluid. Fingers, ears, what might have been a tongue curled like a slug. One jar had nothing but eyes, dozens of them, all looking in different directions. My stomach flipped so hard I almost dropped the phone. I should have run right then. Instead I moved deeper, because that's what idiots in stories do. In the far corner was a workbench lit by a single hanging bulb that flickered when I stepped close, as if it recognized me. Laid out like a surgeon's tray, scalpels, pruning shears, a bone saw. And a notebook bound in cracked leather. The first page read, in Grandpa's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable, "If you are reading this, I failed. Burn everything. Salt the earth. Leave before the roots find you." I took the notebook upstairs and read it by firelight until the flames burned low. Page after page of dates and observations. How the thing in the woods had spoken to settlers in 1847 and taken whole families. How the town founders cut a deal, one life every 25 years to keep it sleeping. How Grandpa had been chosen in 1973 and performed the binding with his own blood and a piece of his left ring finger, jar number 47 on the middle shelf. How the hunger was waking again and the trees were moving closer to the house every season. I laughed when I read that part. Nervous laughter, the kind that tastes like copper. Trees don't move, except I had seen them sway without wind. Except the pine outside the kitchen window was definitely 10 feet closer than it had been that afternoon. I slept with every light on and the axe beside the bed. Dreamed of roots sliding under the door, thick as pythons, wrapping my ankles, dragging me down into loam that tasted of blood. Woke up choking on nothing, sheets soaked with sweat even though the house was freezing. Morning brought weak gray light and a knocking at the door. Earl stood on the porch in a slicker, chewing the same toothpick from yesterday. Power company says the line's fine, he announced without greeting. Means the brakes on your property. Want me to take a look? I let him in because I needed another human voice. He walked straight to the kitchen, opened the pantry, stared down at the open cellar. You went down there. Yeah. Find the jars. Yeah. He sighed like a man who'd lost a bet. Your granddad tried to warn me the last time I saw him alive. Said the binding was fraying and the next in line would have to finish it. I thought he was going senile. Guess not. I asked the question I didn't want answered. What happens if nobody finishes it? Earl looked toward the tree line. Forest takes the town. Starts with the edges, works its way in. People disappear. Animals too. Then the trees start walking upright. He spat the toothpick into the sink. You got maybe a week before it figures out you're here alone. He left me a thermos of coffee and a warning, don't sleep after midnight. Don't answer if something calls your name in Grandpa's voice. And whatever I do, don't bleed on the roots. That night the power came back on by itself. Every bulb blazed white, then dimmed to a sickly yellow. I sat in the living room with the axe across my knees and listened to the house settle. Except it wasn't settling, it was breathing, slow, patient breaths through the floorboards. At 11:58 the lights flickered once and the front door eased open an inch. No wind, no hand, just open. I didn't move. At 12:07, the whispers started, not through the walls, inside my skull. Jackie boy, remember the summers you spent here? Remember the stories I told you about the man in the tree? Come outside, let me show you the rest. The voice was Grandpa's, warm and crackly, the same one that used to read me Treasure Island by flashlight. My legs carried me to the door before my brain caught up. I caught the frame, knuckles white. The fog outside had shape now, tall thin silhouettes with arms too long and fingers that bent backward. They waited at the edge of the yard, patient as stumps. I slammed the door and shoved the china cabinet in front of it. Then I did the same to every window on the first floor. Around 3 in the morning the scratching began, nails on glass, slow and deliberate, like someone testing which pane would break first. I sat on the stairs with the axe and waited for dawn. It came eventually, pale and reluctant. The silhouettes were gone, but the lawn was covered in bare footprints leading from the woods to the porch and back again. Size 13, same as mine. Same as Grandpa's. I drove into town on fumes and panic. The diner was half empty. Marge poured coffee without asking and slid into the booth across from me. You look like death warmed over. I told her everything. The jars, the notebook, the footprints. She listened without blinking, then reached across and closed my hand around something small and cold, an iron nail about 4 inches long. Rowan wood handle wrapped in red thread, she said. Your granddad made a dozen of these. Drive one through the heart of the big oak at the center of the hollow and the binding resets for another 25 years. But you have to do it before the new moon. That's 4 nights from now. I stared at the nail. Why doesn't the town do it together? Because the oak only accepts blood from the same line. Harlan blood. Your granddad was the last. Now it's you or nobody. I laughed again, the same broken sound as before. So I just walk into the woods and hammer a nail into a tree. That's it. Marge's eyes were ancient. You walk in. You might not walk out. But if you don't, none of us will. The next 3 days were preparation and cowardice. I read the notebook cover to cover twice. I sharpened the axe until it could split a hair. I filled every bottle in the house with gasoline and stuffed rags in the necks. I told myself I was being smart, buying time, working up courage. Really I was waiting for someone else to fix it. Nobody came. On the afternoon of the new moon I stood at the tree line with the iron nail in one pocket and Grandpa's journal in the other. The forest smelled like it had the first night, pennies and rotting apples, only stronger now, sweet and sickening. The path was there when it hadn't been before, a tunnel through the pines just wide enough for one man. I walked. The deeper I went the quieter it got, until even the birds giving up. After what felt like hours the trees opened into the hollow, a perfect circle maybe 60 feet across, floor carpeted in moss so thick it swallowed sound. In the center stood the oak. It was bigger than any tree had a right to be, trunk wider than a pickup truck, bark scarred with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Roots humped out of the ground like the backs of buried serpents. And it was bleeding. Dark sap oozed from splits in the bark, running down in slow rivulets that steamed in the cold air. The smell was overwhelming here, cloying, intimate. I took one step and the ground sucked at my boot like it wanted to keep it. They came out of the tree then. Not from behind it, out of it. Bark split and peeled back like skin, revealing pale faces underneath. Men, women, children I almost recognized from old photographs in the cabin, their eyes black, mouths sewn shut with green vine. Grandpa was there too, younger than I'd ever seen him, red flannel hanging off a body half wood. He raised one hand, palm out, showing the stump where his finger used to be. The nail burned cold in my pocket. I pulled it free along with the hammer I'd taken from the shed. 20 feet to the trunk. 15. The rooted people shuffled forward, slow, patient, arms reaching. I swung the axe in wide arcs to keep them back. Bark chips flew like flesh. 10 feet. Grandpa's mouth opened. Vines snapped like thread. His voice came out dry leaves and gravel. Don't make the same mistake I did, Jackie boy. Join us. No more pain. No more lonely nights. Just sleep. I was close enough to see the symbols pulsing now, glowing the same sickly yellow as the light in the cellar. I raised the hammer. He lunged. I buried the axe in his shoulder. Wood split with a wet crack and something dark sprayed across my face. He didn't flinch, just kept coming, arms wrapping around me, bark rough against my skin. More hands grabbed my legs, my arms. The hammer fell. The nail clattered on a root. I screamed. Can't remember what words, maybe just noise. I kicked, twisted, felt fingernails tear. Then my hand closed around the nail again. I drove it upward under Grandpa's jaw, through the soft wood where a throat should have been. He made a sound like a tree falling in a storm and let go. I stumbled forward, hammer in one fist, nail in the other, and slammed both into the trunk right where the bleeding was worst. The iron sank deep with a sound like biting into an apple. The tree shuddered. Every rooted person froze mid-reach. For one heartbeat the symbols flared white-hot and the smell changed to burning cedar. Then the screaming started, not from mouths but from the wood itself, a high keening that rattled my teeth. Roots whipped up from the ground, thrashing. I ran. Branches clawed my back, my face. Something tore my shirt and the skin beneath. I burst out of the hollow into regular forest and kept running until my lungs burned and the path vanished behind me. I came out on the road at dawn, clothes ripped, covered in sap that looked exactly like blood in the early light. Earl was waiting in his truck, engine running. He took one look at me and nodded once. It's done. I held up my left hand. My ring finger ended in a fresh red stump. I didn't remember cutting it off. Had to match the offering, I croaked. He drove me to the hospital in the next county. Doctors asked questions I didn't answer. Infection, they said. Shock. Possible self-mutilation. I let them think what they wanted. 3 weeks later I sold the cabin to an out-of-state buyer who thought he got a steal. I kept the deed long enough to go back one last time with a chainsaw and 10 gallons of diesel. The big oak was already rotting from the inside, symbols blackened, rooted people gone to mulch. I burned what was left anyway. Stood there until the flames reached the sky and the smell of pennies and apples was finally gone. I still wake up some nights tasting sap in my mouth. Still check the tree line outside whatever cheap apartment I'm renting this month. Still count my fingers to make sure there are 10. But the forest is patient. 25 years is nothing to something that old. And I have 24 left.